Good afternoon. I'm John Carlson. I direct the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I'm also an associate professor in religious studies. And I'd like to welcome you to our final CORES conference session, Theology, Technology, and a Post-Secular World. Now, if you don't know what post-secular means, don't worry, neither do I. In fact, some of the panelists may not even know, or not yet anyway. But one of the purposes of this session is, like the larger projects of which it's a part, is to get us to think about the possibility of the post-secular. And that means to me three things. First, understanding the way that the science technology occupies this the secular realm. Secondly, how the divide between religion and science, or religion and secular, kind of closes off our horizons of thinking about science, about religion, about progress, society, human flourishing, and many other things. And third, how we might think beyond this science-religion binary to imagine other ways of organizing our knowledge, our society, our sense of self, our lives. These questions are very relevant to this CORES conference, which our center is very proud to now include and support in its portfolio of externally funded research projects. And we're really pleased to be able to work alongside so many other fabulous units to put on this event. It's just, to me, an exceptional illustration of ASU's commitment to interdisciplinary research, to different units coming together from a variety of different backgrounds to bring new light to problems. And just, I have to reinforce, not all universities are like this. We're really special like this in this way, I think. And it's a true honor to be able to be part of that. I'd also want to just mention at this point that it takes a lot of planning to put on a conference like this. So I just want to thank everyone, all the folks behind the scenes, not just in my center, but all the different units that we're partnering to put this event together. So special thank you. The session today is an outgrowth of the project that's entitled Beyond Secularization, which proposes a new approach to religion, science, and technology in public life. That's where this idea of the post-secular comes in. The Beyond Secularization project, which we don't abbreviate that by its initials for reasons I think you'll probably figure out, so forgive me for saying that out, saying the long version each time. This project, Beyond Secularization, is funded by a generous grant by the Templeton Religion Trust, and it creates, really at the center of the project, this far-reaching research collaborative laboratory, or a collab, that brings together faculty, postdocs, graduate students from an array of different disciplines. And the project's really looking at the intersections of religion, science, and technology in various domains of public life. So environmental movements, high technology innovations that reshape how we live, biotechnological transformations of human life. And there are a lot of really foundational questions that this project is now asking, like how are the forces of bioengineering, digital innovation, transforming our bodies, our lives, our sense of self? What does it mean for us to alter, perhaps irreversibly, the world that our children will inherit? How do religious, spiritual, scientific, secular views of reality shape our ideas of what's important, valuable, dangerous, problematic? We at the center are just so proud to house and support this project. And we're fortunate to have in our panel today 3 faculty leaders of this Beyond Secularization project. Let me briefly introduce them. They are Hava Tirosh-Samuelson, Director of Jewish Studies, Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and Regents Professor of History in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. Ben Hurlbut is Associate Professor in the School of Life Sciences and the Center for Biology and Society. And Gaymon Bennett is Assistant Director at the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics and Associate Professor of Religion, Science, and Technology in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. And we are also joined by a very special guest joining us from England, staying up late to be part of this conversation. Let me introduce him now. Michael Burdett. He is Assistant Professor of Christian Theology at the University of Nottingham and a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at University of Oxford. Before becoming an academic, Michael worked in the aerospace and robotics industries for several years. He worked with a firm that had contracts with NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He holds degrees in engineering, physics, and theology, and has received academic and professional awards in each field. And there's nothing like another theologian reading a bio like that and feeling quite a bit intimidated. His academic interests are like the intersection of science and technology, theology and philosophy, and he's published and presented internationally on continental philosophy, transhumanism, the Technological Society, and Christian theology. Just a final word to the audience. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. You can do so at any point in the conversation. I will be back at the end of this session to moderate questions from the audience. And again, put them in at any time and I'll start queuing those up. I'm now going to turn things over to my excellent colleague, Hava Tirosh-Samuelson. Hava, over to you.
All right, thank you, John. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And it's wonderful to host Professor Burdett with us in this conference. Now, since the conference focuses on the relationship of religion, science, and we are going to add now technology, I would like us to start with that rather than to start with conversation about post-secularism. So the first section or segment of this hour is going to be devoted to the state of this particular field. And you yourself, Professor Burdett, you have written a wonderful overview of the field, which was published in 2017. To people who don't know, that field was established in the United States, at least in the mid-60s, or to be more specific, 1966, when the journal Zygon, the Journal of Religion and Science, was established. So my first question to you is this. Can you give the audience and all of us kind of a quick overview or sense of your understanding of where this conversation is today within the academy? For example, I would ask you to reflect on the most salient and interesting questions today. Let's say, as opposed to questions that were asked in this field maybe 50 years ago. So how have things changed? What do you think has not been given attention to or not sufficient attention to, and where should the conversation go? So we'll begin with that. Please, Professor Burdett.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to the session. Thank you to Professors Carlson and Samuelson for introducing what is just an absolutely exciting event and discussion here. As I keep telling people, what really got me excited was being able to discuss these topics with these three people. I've followed their work with great interest and have had many conversations with them. And it's, whenever you find someone you're like, oh yes, you get it. It is really exciting, I think, in academia. So let me start by just kind of saying what my perspective is, or what do I see science and religion or science and theology doing. So, I mean, at its most basic, science and theology are kind of two different modes of discourse with a common object of study, right? So theology says, it's going to study God and then all things in relation to God, and science studies the natural world. So they have a kind of common object of study. This is creation or nature. However, at least in the field, some people say they can either have, converging or diverging first principles, or some might say metaphysics or methodologies. So what is it that they do? So for instance, theology presumes a kind of a theistic based metaphysics, i.e. in order to understand reality, we have to invoke God, whereas science, is silent on this matter. It brackets metaphysics, these first principles, and it says, It says, look, it just kind of presumes what's often referred to as a methodological naturalism. In other words, it just concerns itself with causes in the natural world and is agnostic about supernatural ones. In practice, right, I think in the history itself, the relation between both of these has been complex. This is often referred to by a historian of science and religion, John Headley Brooke, often referred to as the complexity thesis. So it's not saying that, you know, Draper and White said that, no, that it's always been in conflict between science and religion. Instead, I side more with John Headley Brooke and most historians who say it's complex, this relationship, and always has been. For example, you know, theology contributed very likely to the early development of science because of a belief in an ordered and predictable universe. But equally, theological beliefs about geocentrism, that's the idea that the universe revolved around the earth, didn't really help Galileo advance the heliocentrism at the time. So it's complex, that relationship. But I subscribe personally, or at least in my own work, to what's often referred to as integrationist and dialogical models. Essentially, I think that science and theology ought to be integrated. Or if they can't be integrated or very successful, at least they should be talking to each other. But I also recognize that there can be areas of real conflict. That's certainly true. Or even independence. They might be talking about different things, and that's okay. But I try to avoid that kind of conflict and independence wherever possible. Right, so that's, you know, what academics are great at, throat clearing. But I really think that the field of science and religion is really kind of undergoing a transition, as far as I can tell. So the questions I think that really drove it 60 to 70 years ago, as Professor Samuelson has just said, with the kind of explicit founding of Ian Barber, I think they're really driven by issues that really stemmed from the natural sciences. But today we're seeing a lot more, I think, of the most interesting questions coming from the human sciences. In the past, science and religion was dominated with things like cosmic fine-tuning. So why is it that everything seems to work so well in the physical universe? You know, the implications of the Big Bang for understanding the universe's origin, or even, you know, issues of the age of the Earth and evolution. Now these are all mostly, there's still issues, I think, in science and religion, particularly issues related to evolution, even if I think we're asking new questions about evolution because of significant findings in the evolutionary sciences like paleogenetics, cultural evolution, and comparative psychology. But I think this just highlights that the kind of work being done with the human science today is really where it's all at. So issues related to neuroscience and personhood or free will are pressing, and, you know, rising of this particular area called the cognitive science of religion, it's really exploded in the last decade. And we're really concerned about who we are, it seems, in both the explosion of the human sciences on its own in the last half century have aided a kind of parallel emphasis in science and religion. And indeed, I think the issue of religious or theological anthropology, i.e. the focus on the human being, is also probably the most well-trodden topic in theology and religion, you know, in the last kind of 50 or 60 years as well. So it's this kind of dual drive in both, you know, the human sciences and the sciences being really big, and also turning to the human being and theology and religion. So that provides some kind of explanation. But
so a quick follow-up, and then we'll go to Professor Hurlbut. Do you see a difference between being a theologian and being a scholar of religious studies, or a scholar of the cognitive sciences of religion? How do you position the difference between theologies and those other ways of going about the same questions?
Yeah, so they're different methodologies. They utilize a different kind of toolkit. I engage with the cognitive science of religion, but I also recognize the limitations with the kind of experiments and the kinds of causes and explanations that are warranted. Whereas when I'm doing theology, I have another corpus that I can kind of draw from. But they have commonality. They have things to say to each other. So I'm very happy to go back and forth between using religious studies methodologies, and also really getting into, well, what people actually believe about those things, the actual practitioners, those who are the faithful.
Great. So we're going to bring in Professor Hurlbut, who specializes in science and technology studies. So how do you, Professor Hurlbut, respond to Professor Burdett's opening reflection, or kind of the methodological way he set up the questions?
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Michael, for those opening comments. And I actually thought one of the quite interesting things you said was the distinction that Hava just pointed to, namely between science and religion versus science and theology. And I know that you're very sympathetic to this, what I'm about to say. There's a sense in which much of the work that's been done in science and religion, which is really rightly understood as science and theology, has begun with a kind of tacit presumptions of unity on both sides of that equation. And the sort of complexity thesis is absolutely a push against that, certainly at that intersection, because one need not look very far in the history of relations between science and religion to see that that intersection is highly complex, and that in fact one can't make sense of it without bringing in the sort of sociocultural, political, even economic. The institutions are present there. There are circumstances in which, science and religion have relations that are mediated in all kinds of different ways. But actually, by the way, science and religion in those moments, in one moment versus another moment, may themselves be quite different things because of the ways in which they sit in relation to law, to political institutions, to other forms of knowledge and authority, etc. And so I wanted to ask you, and Gaymon is an anthropologist and so is expert in the art of taking the general and locating it and enriching and thickening it up in terms of the particular. So I think he'll maybe comment on this as well. But if we take an approach to science and religion that doesn't begin with the presumption of unity, where sometimes that presumption of unity imposes itself, but instead begin with a kind of the assumption or the recognition that what fits into the category of science and what fits into the category of religion are complex and are heterogeneous and are dynamic, even protean. And that part of what those respective projects are about is seeking after a kind of coherence. Sometimes what happens on the inside of scientific practice doesn't actually match very well what story is told about science as a kind of a totality, and ditto for religion. I wonder what in the project, in the theological project of exploring that intersection in productive ways, whether disunity is productive, and in what ways. I'll hand it off to Gaymon to tack on to that question if you'd like to.
Well, I'd love to hear Michael's response to that, and I would just maybe add to the question. Hava's opening question asked a bit about where you think the field of science and religion will be going in the future, and it seems to me that Ben's complications of things returns us to that question. So, in addition to the kind of complexity that Ben was just pointing to, and the fact that as they're lived in the world, things that we put in the religion box and things we put in the science box turn out to be very complicated and heterogeneous and the rest of it. I wonder if you could just sort of add to a response to that, the question of then where does the field of science and religion go? And in the spirit, as Ben said, of cultural anthropology, just to give an example, when the origins of a thing that describes itself as a field of science and religion points back to something like 1966 and the work of particular people like Ian Barber. From the start, the task was for Barber and others to say, look, okay, we need to get clear about what science is. We need to get clear about what religion is. And if we can just make sure we know what the boundary looks like, then we can have this like really healthy discussion. But if you kind of take the camera and like zoom out just a bit, like a number of things are happening in that moment. So one of them is the Cultural Revolution, or the countercultural revolution. And cultural revolution is a different thing. We could talk about that too. But the countercultural revolution in the U.S. and other places, in which there's precisely a kind of appetite for a return to spirituality and a kind of transformation of religion back to more lived experiences, back to the material world. The ferment in physics that seemed to be quote unquote weird physics was an opportunity for people to begin to kind of get out of older boxes of, the materiality of science is over there and religion's going to live inside that building on the corner down there, and it's private and science is public. And that stuff was really messy. And someone like Barber is now in this cultural moment in which he can simultaneously respond to all that energy, but then he sort of polices it. Well, to take one step forward, much of the interesting historical work today, as you know, Peter Harrison and others, in Science and Religion is saying like, wait a minute, okay, that moment in which you think science and religion is a kind of fixed category and it's over here, and religion is a fixed category and it's over here, that itself has a history, a long history, political, religious, very Eurocentric history of thinking that these two things live in the world in this way, and that therefore they need to be sort of navigated. And what Harrison and others show us is that Ian Barber moment of saying science is here, religion is here, is itself part of a longer cultural history in which the very categories are not up for grabs in the sense that they're like just arbitrary and cultural, but they are institutional. And they get reproduced and they get policed. And so just to tie it back to the question that Ben asked, like for you, what happens when you see this kind of heterogeneity? And then what happens if science and religion as a discipline puts itself inside the very histories that it's trying to understand?
Yeah, no, these are all great questions. And my first thought was to kind of bring up Peter Harrison's work as an historian who's been really influential here, right? It says we shouldn't begin with science overall or religion overall if we want to really understand the historical interaction, because these boundaries are relatively new in our history, right? So to say that they've always been at warfare or always constant, that's just anachronistic, right? And instead, what you're finding today is, I think, less interest in kind of first principles about how science and religion can interact at all, right? As I kind of said in the beginning, I subscribe to an integrationist model or whatever else. It's like, it's a lot more messy than that. And instead, actually, I think what you're finding is science and religion aren't just these abstract entities that kind of meet in our minds, meet in our kind of intellect. But you're getting this movement today, often termed something called science-engaged theology. And as far as I can tell, what that means in all these different pockets, whether you ask John Perry and St. Andrews, or you ask the folks at Villanova, or you ask the folks at kind of Notre Dame, is we're kind of tired of dealing with engagement at that kind of level of high abstraction. The science is kind of monochrome and homogeneous. Instead, like, let's just get down to the work of doing really specific things and not have all the kind of hangups of, do we have all our methodologies and our metaphysics straight so we can engage? Instead, it's like, hey, we should look at ritual studies in cultural evolution anthropology and then engage with liturgy studies in theology and religion. Or, how does teleology understood in biology help us understand how we understand the theology of creation? So it's a lot more kind of discrete. And it's also, I think, a lot more practical, I think, because it focuses on those really specific things. And I think that kind of really leads into this kind of interesting corollary question of, where do science and religion meet, right? So I think what I hear Gaymon kind of saying is, what that idea of classification you see with kind of Barber and then really challenged by kind of modern historians is, it's not just in the mind. It's not just these kind of pretty little things. Rather, like, what I'm most interested in, what I think the future and the important, questions to be asked are ones that involve the societal and personal impact. How do we experience science and religion in our everyday lives? Not just the issues for the ivory tower, So less of, does quantum indeterminacy, make genuine libertarian free will possible, but more of things like, how do both science and religion tell us something about whether people will want to take the COVID vaccine? Or how does science and religion meet in the decisions people have to make regarding something like in vitro, fertilization, IVF? So religion meets in our everyday lives and our practices, and not just our thoughts. And if I had more things to say, I'd be even in our affects, right? There's a great project that affect theorist Donovan Schaefer and theologian Simeon Zoller are doing about this whole idea of the difference affect and emotion make to how we understand both the production and practice of science and religion and theology. Both, right, are purported to be driven by belief and intellect, but consider how difficult and emotional it is for die-hard creationists to even countenance evolution as being true, or think about climate change deniers or conspiracy theorists. Asking how science and religion meet at the existential emotional level, I think, is really important to understanding things like the intractability and inertia of scientistic and deeply held, religious beliefs. We're invested in them emotionally.
Thank you.
Hava, I didn't know if you wanted to have a kind of closing word on that question, but we could transition here to.
I'm going to push you a little bit. You presented yourself as a person who uses different toolkits, and you have different bodies of knowledge that you integrate into the way you engage those questions. But I think that's too easy. You gloss over some of the challenging differences between the ways of, especially between theology and the way theologian thinks with texts and with traditional context, and the way scientists go about the business. So can you be a little bit more kind of transparent, maybe? You are not just changing your tools. When you change your tools, you're going to get a different kind of result in your analysis.
Well, and not only that, but this kind of speaks to precisely that last kind of issue. I, as an academic, am personally involved in this kind of activity. And it seems to me that it's one thing to be like, sure, I can try out this particular tool set, but I have a vested interest in commitments, especially with something like religion and science, that is more than just a kind of disengaged utilization of these kinds of tools. And it seems to me, at least in terms of why I do theology, is because I want to know, I'm willing to allow any kind of potential interaction, natural, supernatural, to understand what reality looks like. And, I personally have made those kinds of commitments. And therefore, I think in that kind of work, I think a certain level of explanation might require making those kinds of claims and those kinds of appeals.
Okay,
which isn't to say that I don't think religion has any value or whatever else, but that's the game I'm playing.
It's a very nice transition to our next set of questions. If the first was about the kind of field of study around science and religion, in the next part of the conversation, I want to just ask you about your vocation, your life, your practice as a theologian. And then in particular, what it means to be a theologian in a world that is more technologically and scientifically saturated today than it's ever been. And of course, part of what's behind that question is a much longer history of what it means to, be a religious person in the modern world, but then also quite particularly what it means to be a theologian at a time in history that, at least for the last couple of centuries, has been dominated by a kind of secular presumption about which ways of knowing the world get to be public. And it's fine to be a theologian, but you're in your community and you're behind certain closed doors and you publish with certain publishers and the rest of it because, the rest of us are going to talk about the world as it is. And if you want to believe in God on top of that, that's fine. Of course, as we'll talk about when we get to the post-secular, but I want to signal it here, it's always turned out to be a lot more complicated. and the presumption on the part of certain kinds of, if you will, elite intellectual traditions that the world was somehow getting more and more secular, the more and more scientific it got, turned out not to really be true, that, you know, religion and enchantment and magic and the rest of the bundle of things, spirituality not least, is still all around us, all over the place. And so there's simultaneously at least two big things going on. One, the presumption that if the world is filled with technology and science, it must be secular. That's turns out to be a lot more complicated. But also that the fact that religion is still around and all over the place doesn't really disentangle the thing. Okay, all of that a very long way around of saying, you know, as a theologian who is really quite attuned to history, to politics, to technology, what does it mean to be a theologian today? You know, what does it mean to you? How do you understand that as a calling? And then how do you sort of practice that in the world?
Great questions. So in one sense, it's probably worth talking a little about, as you've just asked me, what I see are some of the fundamental activities of the theologian. Well, what is it we get up to? Well, what are my kind of primary tasks, you know, as a vocation, right? I think the easiest and one of the most, I think, adequate that I return to time and again is best illustrated by the mantra of the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church. For those that don't know, council took place in the mid-20th century. It was really a watershed moment for how the church defined its own understanding and its relation to the wider culture and world. And what I find really useful, at least in my own understanding of what a theologian is doing, is representative by the way two words that describe this council, or was kind of often used, you know, over, you know, the many years that the council was held. And the two words were ressourcement and aggiornamento. You know, of course, you know, this is happening in Rome, so you have to have Italian words and then Latin words. So ressourcement meant, you know, going back to the sources, going back to what we've received, the very sources of the religion. For me, Christianity, you know, the very wellspring from which the life of faith depends, you know, which for them and for me, going back to the Bible, going back to the early church fathers, going to tradition of how they understood all this, you know, the practices that have always led to a kind of healthy Christian life. So that was certainly one of the tasks the theologian has is what have we received? What does it mean? That kind of study. But the other term is exemplified, I think, by this Italian term, aggiornamento, which means to bring up to date. And for Vatican II, this meant engaging with the wider world in a way that had really been unprecedented for the Roman Catholic Church for quite some time. And as one commentator, you know, kind of said, they flung wide open the doors to the church. And I think this seems to me to really kind of signal the kind of second major task of theologians is, what do we do with what we have received from the previous generations? How do we engage that with what is happening around us? How do we translate it? And also, how does the contemporary world shed light on that deposit of faith? I think in this sense, to use a well-worn image, the theologian is to have a sacred text in one hand and the newspaper in the other. So therefore, I think the theologian must engage with the wild world, and to do so seriously and severally. But what does the world look like today? And this is what I hear you saying, Gaymon. When I was a budding theological student, I really thought about this. You know, what kind of research topics should I get into? And it was apparent to me, a kid growing up in Northern California, not too far away from Silicon Valley in the 1990s, just as the internet and dial-up modems were becoming a thing, that our culture was in for a major overhaul, and it was undergoing one. So I saw firsthand how, you know, first the personal computer, then mobile technology, you know, internet 1.0, 2.0, are we on to 3.0 yet? I don't know, was impacting the very fabric of our personal and social lives. So I realized that was that aggiornamento I need to be dealing with, engaging with as a young 20-something was, you know, precisely this technological culture. That was one of the conceptual demands, I think, that has really haunted me as a theologian, that I needed to know it from the inside, how to theorize about it. Thankfully, I worked as a systems engineer for several years, so I got to see how things ticked. But along the way, I realized I needed to find others, such as you on this panel, who knew something about the development of technology, the tech culture, who could tell me how it really operated. And I think what a lot of us on this panel realize is how religiously motivated much of that tech industry really is. They have high hopes and dreams on the order of ultimate things that are really, they're talking about things as big as what I deal with in theology. So as you said, some might say, but isn't science and technology the very driving force behind secularism? How can it be a hotbed for religious motivation? I think that's where then talking about a little bit about this idea of the post-secular is so important. And I think I have a vested interest as a theologian, religious scholar, in saying that things aren't as secular as we think they are, or at least where we identify the secular to be, and what we think we know about that is much more complex than it is often perceived to be. Of course, in one sense, our institutions are more secular than they've ever been. We don't need to appeal to God for the founding of our political or social lives to function. People can be relatively happy and lead good lives without explicit theistic beliefs. But one thing I tell my students, for my undergrad students here, it's a research institution, not confessional. First year students in my Christianity and the Christ and Modernity class, is that our secular world is God haunted. We feel the vacuum created by our forebears, supposedly throwing off the shackles of the supernatural, but now we have this task of trying to find meaning in all. I mean, it reminds me, right, of that great poem by Matthew Arnold on Dover Beach, the Sea of Faith, that all I hear now is the melancholy long, the withdrawing roar, as he's kind of looking at this. And what does he say? He says, love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various and so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. So it's like, look, all those things that we thought were really transcendent and amazing, what's really their point? And I think it's here that we start to get to this idea of the post-secular. I take that to mean that things aren't as secular as we think, that religion has no business interacting with things that are really important in the world, or even that the secular is somehow more privileged in its position because it's somehow value neutral in a way that religious perspectives aren't. I think that's just silly. We all value something. We all have ultimate concerns, to use the phrase that are like religious faith, to quote, Paul Tillich. And these concerns animate our lives. We feel deeply about them. We get hurt when others criticize it, if they aren't being sensitive, right? So in one sense, as a theologian, I take heart in the fact that I think people still believe in ultimate things. And I think that a post-secular world means that we're all kind of on the same foot again, religious and non-religious, and that it takes dialogue and honesty to meet, I think, some of these deep, challenges that we're facing today. So I think those are the kinds of things that animate.
Yeah, I would like to take the wonderful comments, the set of comments that you just gave us, and zero in on a particular area which you have written quite a lot about, which is transhumanism.
Yeah.
Where all those areas, the religious, the scientific, the technological, will come together. So can you wrote a book, Engaging Transhumanism from the Perspective of Eschatology. Could you tell us a little bit more so that the audience could get some sense of how do you bring together those areas in your own research?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, what I need to say is Hava got there first when it came to this. As a second or third year PhD student, I was like, gosh, these transhumanists, boy, they look about as close as you can get to secular religious people in just about all their beliefs. And then Hava came out with this great article in Zygon, and I was like, this is great. It's one of those things where you think, I feel vindicated, this is right. But someone beat me to the punch, but I was very thankful for it. So absolutely, the kinds of belief systems that transhumanists, they have an entire doctrine of salvation. It's a salvation that where technology saves them from their actual literal deaths. You have people like notable Ray Kurzweil, who takes between 180 and 210 pills a day to reprogram his biochemistry so that he will live long enough to live forever. He literally, talks about how technology will save us, and is going to keep us from not dying. So this whole, but it's more than just not dying, but it's also enhancing ourselves, right? It's the very glorification of the human being. It's not just Superman, but it's everything you hoped and dreamed. I mean, there's a great piece of writing by notable transhumanist called Nick Bostrom. It's called The Letter from Utopia, where Nick Bostrom's future transhuman self is writing a letter back to his present self and saying, you have no idea how amazing and blissful this is going to be, what kinds of capacities you're going to be able to have, what kind of access to the great kinds of wonderful things. This is just the beatific vision, in a secular kind of way that he's kind of pointing to. So these religious desires, inherent in something which seems to be incredibly secular, right? I think it's that juxtaposition of that complexity that I find really bespeaks a lot of where we are in terms of understanding the post-secular in a highly techno-scientific age.
So, that was great, Michael. All these comments have been great. But I want to pick up on what you just said, which is seems to be secular. Seems to be secular, but isn't? Or is secular and is doing something in the frame of the secular that you're not supposed to do in the secular? And it seems to me that to go back to John's opening comment, I don't know what post-secular means, and maybe nobody else does. It seems to me that we can ask that question in a pretty productive way. And in the following way. Number one, to ask about the ways in which presumptions about, religion and secularity as a kind of distinction, as a knowable distinction, as a sort of distinction that can be known a priori. It's known, religious when you see it, or secular. The way that presumption is done work. Okay, so post-secular might mean, hey, actually, we have been committing ourselves to seeing things in these terms, and therefore we've been imposing these terms on things that we should not have been imposing them on, perhaps, or rather imposing them on things was a project, as opposed to a lens that gave us clarity about the true order of things. And that, we might say post-secular in the sense of we're going to set that aside. We're going to not impose that upon ourselves and allow us to see things that shouldn't be if the world sorts itself neatly into those distinct categories. And then suddenly you can see something like transhumanism in the terms they use it. But the appears to be secular is an important moment, because do we reassert the boundary and we say, well, this purports to be secular, but actually it falls on the religion side of the line? Or do we say, this is secular and it falls on the religion side of the line, and therefore the line is a problem, and we ought to attune ourselves to stuff that we have not been attuned to before? And, Dover Beach, a moment of emptiness. I mean, as you're pointing out, that emptiness is getting filled in myriad different ways. So I also was a sort of, well, I guess I was more of a latecomer than you, because you anticipated the Hava's article, even if you didn't write it, and she did. But I did jump on that bandwagon, mostly because I was interested in this sort of strange, they're the transhumanists over here, and you can put them in a box and describe, but then they're the people like standing next to them, and the people standing next to them, and pretty soon they're just the people that you're standing next to, and you can't exactly say what it is that differentiates, the mainstream over here from, the utopians over there, because they're all actually, in a sense, talking a a talk with continuity. It's just that, the letter from Utopia is really, turning up the volume. Same song.
Yeah, that's very
And one of the things that's been striking to me, when Hava and I had a project focused on transhumanism long ago now, and I mean, that was very interesting to see the sort of that sort of continuity between, transhumanist Silicon Valley and other elements of Silicon Valley or whatever. But since then, transhumanism has gotten a lot more mainstream. So like, when journalists write about, human genetic engineering and genome editing, they write about transhumanism. And it's like there's actually this sort of expertise about the human future that's been sitting there because it's been imagining its transcendence. And suddenly here we are, I might say technology's caught up with the vision, but I actually don't buy that. It seems to me that technology's been led by the vision in important respects. And so you might say post-secular in the sense that we're actually in a different moment than we were in, say 1966, when you actually could think there is the secular and there is the religious, and religion is the thing you do on Sunday or you do on Saturday or whatever, and it stays over here in this part of life. And that actually that delineation is behind us, and there's a lot more mixing, just as there in a sense has always been, but we better start paying attention to that. So what I want to ask you, sorry, that was a very long preamble to a question. What I want to ask you is what in your view are the places to look that are most productive to look at doing theology? What do you find to be the richest places to look in order to find that place where, the Bible and the newspaper can be brought together most productively in order for us to be in a position to do that work of making sense? And the second piece of that question is, there is the doing of one's own work, but then there's the question of how that work sits in a larger landscape. And if you live in a secular world, theology is a thing that lands on Sunday or Saturday or whatever. But if you live in a post-secular world, maybe it's a little bit different actually. And you might wander out into spaces that are ostensibly secular and have things to say about them that are theological and yet occupy a different place in the sort of public sphere, and maybe refuse to accept assumed boundaries between science, religion, secularity, public and private. So what do you think?
Yeah, no, what you're describing, I think, is absolutely right. And your concern that about what you said in the very beginning about what makes us want to slip back into it's purported to be secular, or it is. And part of that, I think, is a particular kind of compulsion that at least the way that public life is sold to us is that the rules of public discourse operate this way. So even in and you see this, I think, in even contemporary, not just contemporary religious studies, but a certain movement for the way that certain religious faiths might interact with each other. So one way in which, let's say, a Christian and a Muslim might interact is about saying something about, their kind of common religious affectations, right? That might make them common. In which case, you're reducing that kind of discourse to a common third, almost a foreign third category. They both have particular kinds of experiences, or they have certain kinds of understandings about God, and therefore, like, what the kind of interaction they'll have will be mediated by this third space, right? And what you're finding is, at least I think in terms of what I find very interesting as a turn away from this way of understanding how interreligious dialogue happens, instead of pausing the third space, just do comparative theology. Let's just talk about love in our own terms, rather than saying, well, by love, from a religious perspective, we're really just talking about, the feelings of absolute dependence in the face of the absolute. We don't have to have this third thing necessarily to be talking about. So in some ways, that kind of change tells us something about, do we need this third space? Which I got to tell you, it feels foreign to the people within the faith to abide by it, at least if you're having the kind of dialogue with same kind of terms, then there's a certain faithfulness, I think, to one's own tribe, language, game, placedness, context of where you kind of begin. But at the same time, I am kind of convinced. I remember reading Charles Taylor's, Behemoth, the Secular Age, when I was a graduate student with some really, really wonderful people in a pub in Oxford every week, trying to trawl through this thing and, cursing his editor for not chopping this thing down when it really could have done. And then finally, at the very end, you get the immanent frame. This has a lot of explanatory value, it seems to me. And that kind of compulsion to a third space, I think, is really Taylor's understanding of this immanent frame. That in order for us to understand what secularity looks like, is we've abided by this thing that it's only immanence that we're concerned about. We can talk about transcendence and immanence, or if you want to talk about, like transcendence within your own kind of group, you can't do that if you're going to be doing it in any kind of public way. And I think part of that's still valid. And part of me thinks like the post-secular is saying, do we need the immanent frame? What happens if we lose it? And it seems to me that at least a lot of people will be like, will that just lead to religious violence? Will that lead to, pluralization and extremism, right? All the reasons why, religion, according to Peter Harrison, was, or by, William Cavanaugh, was invented to essentially kind of talk about the myth of religious violence. That's why we needed the state to intervene. So I completely, I think, get, that wanting to kind of turn to the post-secular. And it helps us to better understand what's going on with some really discrete case studies, right? You brought up transhumanism, but the way in which, look, if you take, Anders Sandberg, next to, some of the people that are in, George, is it George Church who does stuff with synthetic biology or whatever? Yeah, and you kind of keep going down the line to just, somebody who's, just in kind of, I would say, a virtual nomad in technological culture. There's a lot of similarities there. I think that's absolutely true. And the very, I'm reminded of this article that came out in Washington Post. I think it was entitled "Pondering What It Means to Be Human on the Frontier of Gene Editing." And I think, the majority of the article focuses on the work and personal reflections of Jennifer Doudna, that I'm sure all know, right? The Berkeley scientist who's often attributed with inventing the latest biotech tool, that's causing a stir amongst ethicists and researchers, so CRISPR-Cas9. And, these articles are often sent to me, as a bioethicist. And, and what was interesting about the article, as the title suggests, was the way that it indicated, these kind of meta-ethical concerns, meta-ethical in the sense I think of religious. There was an actual quotation from Doudna, who she was recounting a particularly powerful interaction with a mother who had, a child with Down syndrome, and the mother was explaining to Doudna that despite the technical feat that her new gene editing tool would give, she would never consider changing her child with the very application that Doudna had invented. And Doudna said, with tears in her eyes, it really makes you think hard about what it means to be human, doesn't it? And she even says in her book, A Crack in Creation, that she's had these really vivid dreams of coming face to face with Adolf Hitler. He says to her, "I want to understand the uses and implications of this amazing technology you developed." Here we have one of the most important scientists talking about probably the most important scientific discovery. And what form does the rumination take? She asks big questions, perhaps even questions in a religious register. If you think about what it means to be human, who are we really? Where are we going with this? What happens if someone really awful gets hold of it and, wants to start a modern eugenics movement and transform the future of the human race to fit their egregious and terrible ends? So the scientists, The technologists are asking these questions. And if that's the case, then I'm like, maybe it is all, maybe if they're doing theology, I shouldn't feel bad about doing it either.
Absolutely. Just a little footnote to that. One of the sort of no-nos that gets pointed to all over the place in when experts are commenting on public discourse around biotechnology is that people talk about playing God. And yet George Church can write a book called Regenesis and Jennifer Doudna can write a book called A Crack in Creation. I think that there's a lesson there that these are the questions that are being asked. And then there's the question of what are the ways in which they can be opened up and what are the constraints that we place on ourselves that in the name of the secular or whatever else. So I want to toss it back to maybe Gaymon and then Hava for any further reflections.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Michael, I wanted to ask you about the third space. Now that you've said we don't need the third space, I nonetheless want to ask you about the third space, or what I think might be the third space, which for lots of people is spirituality. And as you know, there have been major demographic shifts in Europe and North America, other parts of the world as well, over the last half century, in which the world didn't so much become like more secular as lots of sociologists anticipated, but you did see this huge demographic growth around people who said they're spiritual but not religious, and there's been lots of work on that. But it seems to me that someone like Taylor, what he misses in talking about the immanent frame, and for those who don't know it, for Taylor, it's like basically the idea that the only stuff that gets to count is stuff that's in this world. And so what doesn't count is like the God stuff. But what Taylor misses in the immanent frame is like all of the magic stuff, if you will, the kind of the spirituality and the metaphysics in this world, the very kind of materiality of the supernatural, or what modern people call the supernatural. And so I wondered if we could just get into that a little bit. And, if you'll forgive me doing a sort of professor thing and sort of giving a little pocket history to kind of point to what I'm interested in. Ben has this really nice image of Silicon Valley. You can point to one end where there's like Ray Kurzweil or Nick Bostrom, and then the person next to them, and then the person next to them, person next to them. And pretty soon you're back to yourself. And where in that sequence did the thing change? But the other thing that's true about Silicon Valley is like you can go from Nick Bostrom to the person next to Nick Bostrom, and you're already at somebody who believes in something supernatural. It's like spirituality is all over that place. And it turns out, of course, the spirituality is, or something that might broadly be called spirituality, is all over lots of things. And this seems to me quite a remarkable moment in our kind of cultural history. I'm anthropologist. I come out of the history of the human and social sciences. The human and social sciences were born in the 19th century precisely as a systematic attempt to name an object in the world called religion. Sometimes it was animism as a kind of bigger category. The French would do religion. The British started out with animism. But the political stakes of that move were shared. And the political stakes were, hey, there are these weird people in the world who think there's this stuff that's supernatural and that it's real, and that it has actual effects on their lives, and that like if you're going to provide a coherent description of reality, it would have to include that stuff. And I, the social scientist, am the one who's freed myself from false consciousness. That is to say, I became secular, and now I can see how there's like real life, lots of material stuff, power relations, social formations, and it maybe gets glued together by belief in something supernatural. But in fact, what's really real is like strip all that stuff away. Okay, so you don't even get the category of religion as an object of study for social science without the kind of invention of the secular, but the secular in a kind of metaphysical sense of like that thing, which is not magic, it's not spiritual, there's no gods there, there's no angel, there's no demons there, there's no fortune telling there, there's no tarot cards, there's none of it. So now jump back to like the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. the third term all the way through the 19th and into the 20th century wasn't spirituality, it was superstition. So you could be religious, and that could be maybe protected by law, or at the right kind of cocktail party, maybe it's respected if you are, you know, an upstanding Presbyterian, or whatever. But you can't do this other stuff, like the kind of sloppy metaphysical new religion stuff. Well, Silicon Valley, 21st century, what was once sort of sloppy metaphysical, maybe new age, is like corporate self-branding and the wellness industry and mindfulness, and you know, so it has lots of sort of vaguely secular-esque descriptions, except that it really is spirituality. And if you scratch the surface even just a little bit, people have a much more complicated picture of the world. That was way longer than it needed to be, but to sort of come around to the fact that sort of in the language of our project, like hiding in plain sight there, are these ways of being in the world that are quite enchanted, that have a lot to do what's happening in these spaces. And for your work as a theologian, like, where's the meeting point between the thing that we used to call religion that was trying to make reality claims and this whole set of things that are circulating in the world today?
That's really interesting. There's a lot of things I could say. I mean, part of it, of what I hear you saying, is if part of the issue with naming things as secular is that you still have enchantment to some degree, you're just calling it something different, or you're not engaging with it in your professional life. I mean, you think of, you know, the Jameses, Henry and William James, who, you know, famously were some of the greatest practitioners of spiritualism in their own time. The beginning of kind of, you know, psychology, you know, but at least, you know, William James was willing to, like, really wanted to study this stuff, this actual psychic phenomena as being a part of the actual world itself. And yet that gets drained, right, increasingly as we go on. Or, I mean, this is a really personal experience I had going to Freud's house outside of London. All of his things, right, because he had to flee Nazi continental Europe. You go into his study, what do you see but hundreds and hundreds of ancient Near Eastern deity figurines lining his very desk, 30 to 40 of them, as he's coming up with the foundation of this very social science. The origins of it, right, are deeply, deeply enchanted, right? I think to that kind of degree. So even in these kind of places in the social sciences at the beginning, you have a lot more kind of cross-pollination and slippage, you know, for the beginning. And I think they're drawing upon both of these different areas. And so how do I see theology doing it? Well, at least I'm being explicit about those things, and it's not just coming out in any kind of loose way, but I'm trying to integrate it and understand it, if that makes sense. You know, so rather than just being hey, I engage with it, you know, on the weekend and kind of have fun, and, you know, it's like, yeah, we've been reflecting on this stuff for a long time. We kind of figure out, like, what makes it tick, what doesn't make it tick. We might be wrong about it, but hey, it's worth studying it.
That's a very good segue to our question and answer, to get the audience involved, and the questions will be fielded to us by John Carlson.
Well, let me first off start by thanking all of you for this really rich conversation. So much to think about. I have a whole sheet of questions here that I'd love to raise, but I will have to do that another time because we have questions in the Q&A function here that I want to share. And just a couple of things. My suggestion would be that maybe one person, two persons at most, maybe tackle a question so that we can get to as many questions as possible. And that as well, you all should have access, you, the panelists, should have access to the Q&A function. So if you, when you're not speaking, have a chance and want to scroll through that and offer a quick response, that may be helpful for some of the questions we aren't not able to get to. First question here is from Lori Matola. Do any of the panelists use insights they receive in prayer or meditation etc., in their study of material science. In other words, can the connection with God or consciousness provide clues for use in scientific discovery? Who wants to take that one? All right, Michael, that's you.
No, I'm the furthest away from doing like bench science.
I'm happy to jump in on this.
Okay, great.
I also don't do bench science, although I hang out with some. I want to say I play one on TV, but the answer is absolutely. This point that Michael just made is a really crucial one, that even at the founding of those scientific practices that explicitly claimed that there is no, if you will, spirit in the world, there was already a whole set of kind of regulative mechanisms, I don't know a better term for it, by way of which Freud knew when he was publishing a paper, he could say certain things. And when he was alone in his office, he could say certain things. And when he was like in the clinic, he could do certain things. And when he was at a seance, he went to a lot of seances, it turns out, he could do certain things. And this idea that there are different spaces in our lives where only certain things are allowed to happen, like very easily becomes the idea that somehow those spaces are isolated, like categorically, as though the spaces were designed that way because quote unquote reality really is like that, as though the universe were chopped up into job over here, suburbia over here, elementary school over here, grocery, as though city planning were like a map of our souls. And the fact of the matter is, for any scientist worth their salt, and the scientists who among us can either agree or disagree, life isn't chopped up. And so if you spend time meditating, then when you go and do your science, like it infuses into your work. And if you do your prayer, it infuses into your work. I'm part of a project right now. We're trying to get funding for this, but with a group of scientists in which we're looking at old monastic traditions of work as prayer, in order to think about what it would look like for the very material practices in the lab to be the scene and site of self-formation, kind of ethical, spiritual self-formation. And part of the reason we want to do that is because we recognize in the grant that like self-formation happens all the time in all the things that we do. And so if you have a space in your life like a lab where you're spending 10 hours a day and you act as though all this other ethics, spirit stuff isn't in there, then all that's happening is those formations are taking place without you doing it on purpose. And so the punchline to that is that even though our institutions regulate certain kinds of activities, as human beings, of course, these things cross-fertilize all the time.
Anybody else want to briefly weigh in on that?
Well, I just want to follow up. I think that's really interesting. You're exploring that idea, Gaymon, particularly when Francis Bacon in the 16th century, who's often referred to as the founder of modern science, or at least Baconian science, throwing off the shackles of, Aristotelian physics, of first principles, how we know the natural world. It shouldn't be through kind of, first principles that we deduce about, abstract things to like the way things happen, but through empirical methods. Famously, in the New Atlantis, which is his kind of utopia, is like, this is what's going to happen to society if you guys follow essentially my new way of production of knowledge. And guess what? The very heart of it was this monastic community doing the kind of hours, doing kind of religious kind of rituals alongside doing the kind of scientific work. Yeah, I mean, that's deeply interesting.
We have another question from Martin Aslava, and it's a sort of sociological question, but it'd be very interesting to hear you all weigh in on this, particularly perhaps in light of other panels today and in this conference. To what degree do you see new pastoral approaches or religious approaches in any religion in favor of modernism/scientism as being effective, more likely to attract new congregants? And I think he's positioning this as, over and against a resurgence of new traditionalism, particularly Catholic America or high Anglicanism, as a knee-jerk reaction to engaging with modernity. So as scholars and working on questions of religion, science, technology, do you want to reflect on what that might mean for religious movements, sort of jockeying back and forth between more progressive and conservative or traditionalist approaches to attract new followers?
Maybe Ben, maybe that's for you. Within the Catholic traditions, those are interesting issues. In the Jewish tradition, it's a different story.
Well, it's definitely not for me, but I'll say something about it if you'll promise to say something about it afterwards, Hava. And that is that I mean, this isn't exactly answering the question, but it's pointing to something that I think is back of it, which is, you know, keeping up with the times, right? And you know, what are the ways in which one does the Bible in the one hand, newspaper in the other, sort of synthesis, and you know, religion stays relevant, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it is clearly it's a preoccupation. The story of secularization said that it better be a preoccupation, because no matter what you do, you're toast, religion. You know, so there's a sort of reactive response to that, maybe. But I think, I mean, what Michael was saying earlier about the kinds of questions that Jennifer Doudna, who really had never engaged with questions of that sort, it's certainly not through the frame of her sciences before she sort of stumbled upon a very powerful technique. Those sort of questions that she was finding herself confronting, it seems to me points to something important, and that is we tend to tell ourselves a story about progress, right? And in an ostensibly secular modernity, the overwhelming story that we tell ourselves about progress, especially these days, is that it's driven by basically advances in science and technology, right? I mean, you want to measure progress, look at, you know, what we drove in the 1920s versus what we drive today, or what we made our phone calls on in the 1980s versus what we do today, or something like that. The fact that we're having this conversation in this modality, that is what maps the trajectory of progress. And then the rest of it sort of has to fall into line and adapt itself accordingly. There's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy dimension to that. And there's sort of in two ways. One is what, you know, in what ways we consider certain dimensions of our ostensibly carved up lives subsidiary to other ones. Where are we carried along versus where are we agential? Well, we're agential by acting non-agential and allowing ourselves to be carried along, if you see what I mean. Submitting to the sort of a particularly powerful imagination of how change happens, what sort of counts as progress. But number two is submitting ourselves to incorporating, sort of even subjectivizing the kinds of distinctions that Gaymon was pointing to earlier. So to go back to our conversation about transhumanism, I mean, one of the moves that's really fascinating to me is that moment where, let's take Ray Kurzweil as our figure, right? Where, you know, he's, you know, telling the story of a kind of eschatology, and you say, whoa, wait a minute, man, like, isn't this religion? He said, no. This is just a kind of a law of socio-technical change, right? I mean, this is how technological progress generates technological progress. This is what it looks like when you plot it on the curve, you know, and this is a kind of inevitability. This is reality. And we are just sort of floating along on top of these currents. And so in, you know, the meaning story is the sort of meaning story is supposed to be subsidiary to this kind of natural law of progress story. In other words, the religious story is sort of subsidiary to the secular story, and the secular is where the authority or expertise lies, and why this person gets to say the way things are, which is to say, this person gets to mix those different categories that Gaymon was saying are on different sides of town, but other people don't get to. And those things seem to me, and I think in this project that Gaymon, Hava, and I are associated with, and Michael is now entangled with and should become more entangled with, these are some of the things we want to keep our eye on, because number one, those parts of town are not separate. But number two, the way in which the notion that they are is sort of enforced upon us, or we enforce it upon ourselves, has material significant effects, including in, the transformations of institutions that are feeling anxiety about their own position in the modern world.
Well, we have 1 minute left before John needs to switch us to the final comments for the day. I'll just remind us, and I'm going to keep it very short, that the way we think about the secular is always historically situated and culturally determined. And the whole conversation, including the questions that we got in the Q&A, are told from a particular perspective. I would call it the Christian Western perspective. It's not even Eastern Christianity. It's really primarily Western Christianity. So I, as a Jew, always remember myself as an other in that conversation. And just let us keep in mind that when Professor Carlson started with the question, what is post-secularism? A lot depends on the cultural situatedness of that term. How you understand that is culturally dependent. And with that, maybe, John, you can move us to the final concluding set.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Hava. I'm glad you raised that. I was thinking of a professor who also taught at the University of Nottingham, Robert Marcus, who wrote this little book on Christianity and the secular, and reminded us that it was really just this, in his view, this third category between what was sacred and what was profane. And in some ways, that's a very, very capacious category, particularly for a pluralistic kind of society in which we live. But it still comes out of a Christian definition of that which is, the here and now between the first and the second coming of Jesus. So I have one final question in the Q&A that I'm going to use. I think is really a nice question, but I'm going to actually direct it to Barry Ritchie, who is a physicist as well as a believer. And then I'm going to turn things over to him to offer closing comments, but this will be a nice little transition. So Barry, one of our panelists asks, if the scientific community, one of our audience members, Mike Turney, asks, if the scientific community were to formally acknowledge that a creator may indeed exist and that the scientific method can contribute to the search, including revealing what the creator is not, wouldn't that go a long way in uniting science and theology or religion while simultaneously supporting both? You want to take a swag at that?
Well, let me thank the questioner for the question, and I'm sympathetic to the direction you're heading, but sadly that really isn't the way science works. We don't have an authority per se. It is a community that isn't of one mind on this question. And so, like I said, even though I'm sympathetic, I think, to your position, science really doesn't organize itself around that an authority figure or whatever. So there would be no authoritative declaration by some group of scientists somewhere as to whether or not this particular idea about God held or not. In the last analysis, that's probably a good thing. Remember that science is always provisional. And so I remember once being told that I was dogmatic about the periodic table. And so there are certainly some beliefs that we are pretty sure are right. But in the back of our mind, in our heart of hearts, we are always of the mind that most of the conclusions we have are provisional and approximations. And so when they come up against something like an absolute being, we sort of shy away from that. So again, I'm sympathetic to your position, but sadly, that's just not the way we work.
Well, let me take this moment to thank everybody all of our panelists for joining us, to Professor Burdett for staying up late to join us especially. You can crawl into that bed that's 2 feet away from you now. I'm going to turn things over now to Professor Barry Ritchie to offer closing comments on the conference today, and then there will be a social hour, cocktail hour online at 4 o'clock, and there'll be a separate web channel for that. So along with the other panelists who are in this session, we're going to now mute our microphones and go off of our video and turn things over to Barry. And again, thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, for those fantastic questions. So long. Barry, over to you.
Okay, and just like that, we're at the end of our conversations. As John indicated, in a few minutes, we'll head over to the virtual happy hour. Let me call on Misty Faulkner to explain how that's going to work, because most of us haven't gone to a virtual happy hour. Misty, how's that going to work?
Well, I think as much as we love love attending conferences in person, just simply because we can get together after we hear all these amazing sessions and all of the great speakers. We love to be able to come to the table and talk about what we loved best and the ideas that we have, and how can we actually help to move some of these ideas forward. So we're going to have a Zoom room open here in just a few minutes, and it's actually going to be a Zoom meeting instead of a webinar. So we'll have some broader conversations all together with everyone kind of chiming in. And then we'll also be doing some breakout sessions so that you'll be able to go maybe a little bit deeper with just a few people at the table. So hopefully we'll see you soon, and see you again next year for another amazing conference. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Barry, as I go to get ready.
Okay, so thank you, Misty. And what a remarkable event we've had here. In addition to 34 faculty members from 15 academic units at ASU, we've hosted guests from 13 other educational institutions. In the Middle East and Africa, we had American University of Sharia in the United Arab Emirates, Shalem College in Jerusalem, and the University of Cape Town in South Africa. In the United Kingdom, we had the universities of Cambridge, Nottingham, Oxford, and University College London. In the United States, we had American Jewish University, Chapman University, the Mayo Clinic, Middle Tennessee State University, Rice University, and Villanova University. So on behalf of the CORES project and all our audience members, please let me say thank you to all our panel members throughout the 5 conversations. You've provided much food for thought, and you've also provided a beautiful model of discussions among people who disagree about important things, but can still discuss those topics and learn from each other without seeking to overcome the other or convert the other. Please let me also now recognize those local colleagues whose collective efforts with me made this event possible. The steering committee for CORES, that's Gaymon Bennett, John Carlson, Paul CORES, Paul Davies, Pauline Davies, Ross Emmett, Carolyn Forbes, Ben Hurlbut, Carol McNamara, and Hava Tirosh-Samuelson. Also, our technological wizards and logistical folks, staff members Dawn Beeson, Mason Hunt, Lisa Kaplan, Sarah Lords, Joseph Martin, Morgan Raddick, Catherine Siebold, and Jessica Stryker. Also from the Arizona Center for Christian Studies, Misty Faulkner, who you saw just a second ago, and Ben Sanders. To all our audience members, I hope that you have enjoyed these discussions. Please mark your calendars tentatively for the next conference, CORES 2022, February 10th to 11th at Arizona State University next year. Also, if you are interested in programs such as this, please consider financially supporting the CORES project by going to the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict to find out how to donate there. That's all, folks. I'm Barry Ritchie from Arizona State University. Thanks for participating, and I'll see you at the happy hour.